All right, so let's talk about Roman sexuality. And for anybody who's ever had a toga party, you may have some idea that the Romans were considered these great, by modern standards, were thought of as these sort of crazy sexual beings. And that's because so many of the artifacts we found are sexual in nature, sex related. But just a few main points about Roman sexuality. This picture you're looking at here is depicting, there's a lot of gay male homosexual acts depicted in Roman sexuality. You can see it here. Couple of other, so homosexual acts, again, no word for homosexuality, but the men were fairly fluid and they could go back and forth. Um, Another important thing to know is, like with Greek society, Roman prostitution was legal, it was public, and it was commonplace. It was considered in many ways to be a good way to control society, to get people to um, have sex, and if they didn't have a partner, or but to have sex and basically be a little more placid as a society because of sexual release. You can see remains of the elite households, the rich, and you'll notice that erotic art hangs there. So imagine if your parents just had like erotica hanging in the living room, what that might be like to have your friends over. But that's the way it happened in Roman times. Like again with the Greek society, men could have sex with either men or women, but it was preferable to display dominance. In other words, be what we call now the top, the penetrator, rather than the penetratee. Um, and again, much of the religion had aspects of sexuality in it, like Venus and Cupid. And men, but not women, were allowed sex outside of marriage. Some other important points to note. This here is a picture of Pompeii. I think I'm going to go to Pompeii this year. But Pompeii is Mount Vesuvius is a mountain in Italy, and it erupted at one point, and basically all the people were frozen in place, and they were just covered with lava and ashes, and they died kind of right in the middle of what they were doing. So you can see it gives us a really well preserved idea about what Roman society was like in that time. You can go and visit this site right now. Pompeii, interestingly, when it was first discovered, the king came, I think it was the king of Spain, came to see it and shut it back down because it was so risque for the time period. Um, but literally, you can see a brothel in Pompeii where they have on the wall various sex acts and how much they cost. There's the street signs are made to look like a penis, and there's a huge palace. I mean, there's a huge penis structure in the street. So they were very, very open with their uh, uh, erotic nature. So fast forwarding some years to ancient Judaism, um, and here's some art from that time. Some of the biggest concepts we get from ancient Judaism have to do with, and by the way, a lot of this we get from like the Old Testament, what's considered the Old Testament to Christians and what's considered the Torah to Jewish folks. But you see a lot written about cleanliness. We think there was some idea at the time, there were some STDs, or sexually transmitted diseases like gonorrhea. That's written about in the Old and New Testament. And we think that probably people had an idea that sex could lead to disease. And so there became this focus on cleanliness and purity, that started to permeate Judaism, and later to some degree continued into Christianity. Um, this is where you see women when they're menstruating, they were considered impure and had to go to a hut for the days they were menstruating. But you just see a lot written about the right ways to have sex. You see this a lot in the chapter of Leviticus. A lot is written about And this is when you see all the strange things about, you shouldn't eat seashells because those could also be impure, and you shouldn't wear certain kinds of garments. Again, there's this focus just on cleanliness, probably associated with disease, or they just had tons and tons of rules. Let me give you an idea of some of the rules. I don't know if you can see this or not, but it's a summary, a flow chart of a summary of all the rules that they had in ancient Jewish society about when you could have sex. And if you can't see it, here it is right here. Is your wife menstruating? If she is, that's a sin. If she's pregnant, yes. If she is, that's a sin. If she's not, then you have to ask, is she nursing? No. Is it, if she's not, is it Lent? Is it, so you couldn't have sex during Lent, during Advent, during Whitsun week, during Easter week, during feast day. Has to be married, has to be your wife, etc. Has to be for procreation, can't be in church, etc. So there's just so many rules about sexuality, and many of those were carried over to Christianity. So let's talk about that. Okay, so this guy here, as well as the guy in the next slide, is named Saint Augustine of Hippo, and he probably he's back to 400 BACE, or 400 after Christ. We call it something different by now, but so really early. But you still see his beliefs in modern day Christianity. He was an interesting character. He had a lover who was lower class for many years, and then in his 30s he converted to Christianity, and he quickly moved up through the church and became a pope. And he wrote a lot about sexuality. Though he had a wild youth, when he converted, he became very, very pristine in his views toward sexuality. And he wrote things like men's erections were, even just the erection, an involuntary erection, is sinful. It was at this point that you start to see the notion that it's women's fault if men have unwanted or undesirable sex. I'm not quite saying that well enough, but men's sexuality was in many ways regarded the responsibility of women. And women, it's our place to not show our bodies, to not tempt men, because men are seen as slaves to their sexual impulses, and if they're tempted, then they almost can't help it. St. Augustine wrote that sex was only for procreation, and even for procreation, the sexual act was sinful. It was necessary, but sinful. Let's see. So again, many edicts also carried over from Judaism. The only good reason was to have sex was to make babies. By the way, let me just give you a timeline. I'm not a historian. These are rough numbers. We don't know the exact numbers in a lot of these cases anyway, or they're disagreed upon. But the Greeks dominated roughly before the year 0, and then the Romans were about up to 400, and then came ancient Judaism. Now, Judaism had been going on for a long time, but what we sort of now think of as Judaism was more around this period, and then Christianity came and dominated. Then you have the Middle Ages, and let's see if I can move this over here. And the Age of Enlightenment. Now, Enlightenment was a time when, let's see if I can move this over. That's when you started to see more advances in technology, but also advances in attitudes. We started to say things like maybe it's not a good idea to have slaves, maybe democracy is a good idea. And you had a lot of advances in art and science. Roughly around 1800, Queen Victoria in England was born, and she died right around 1900. So that's the Victorian age. The first sexual revolution was around 1910, and that was sort of a reaction toward Victorian sexual principles. Second sexual revolution was 1960 to 70, and then today. So just to give you an idea of how all this stuff plays out on a timeline. Here is some art from the Middle Ages, or medieval times, also sometimes called. And pretty much the Catholic Church dominated everything. And only priests were allowed to read. So that's part of why they call it the Dark Ages sometimes, because education wasn't valued, and the priests were considered to be much higher status than the peasants, uh, as well as royalty. But Middle Ages, we have a few things that still trickle down. Ideas about chivalry or men um, doing good deeds for women came from around this time, and some just sort of mm, some ideas about dating and the role of men and women in dating. Um, this idea of ennobling love came about from Middle Ages. Now, ennobling love is this is sort of pure love from afar, um, that women were really put up on a pedestal, as seen as being somehow more virtuous than men. And actually, we shouldn't have impure thoughts about women unless they were prostitutes. Um, think about Gwendolyn and Guinevere and Lancelot, how he sort of loved her in a pure way from afar. That's ennobling love. Interestingly, you did see some, unlike some previous and later eras, you saw women being thought of as lusty. You could see that word being applied to women, whereas women were sort of desexualized in most of history and thought of as being asexual compared to men. One interesting thing you start to see happen here, um, if you think about marriage, this idea of marriage is up until the Middle Ages and pretty much through the Middle Ages. What was marriage about? And by the way, there's a really fun book called Marriage: A History, just about the history of marriage in Western society. I suggest you read it. It just gives you all sorts of information about the concept of marriage. But up until and including the Middle Ages, you see marriage is only associated with a couple of things, and that's combining properties. It's a financial and business arrangement. Now remember, in this time, women are considered the property of men. When you're born, you're the property of your dad, and then he gives you to, uh, at the marriage ceremony, he gives you to your husband, and then you're the property of your husband. And marriages were arranged to increase power and wealth. So let's say that you had a piece of land, and you have a neighbor who also has a piece of land, and they have a son and you have a daughter, then it would be advantageous to marry them. And that way you would all have this same sect of land. You'd combine your property, and maybe you'd have a little army and people working for you. So that was the purpose of marriage. But you start to see some writings about, wouldn't it be nice if I liked my husband or wife? And you see the very beginnings of people talking about love and marriage going together. This will increase through the Victorian times, and of course, in modern times, at least in Western society, you don't marriages aren't arranged, and usually in our heteronormative ideas about marriage, that marriage and love are always combined. Um, so those are some things you see happen in the Middle Ages. Let's see if I can pause it. Okay, so with the Victorian age, again, roughly 1800 to 1900, when Queen Victoria was alive. Again, many advances in the sciences and in medicine, particularly during this time. You can see these pictures of women. They're not showing any of their body except for their face. Their necklines come all the way up to the top of their neck. Victorian age is now, there's some changes in how we think about this these days. We've thought of it as being a very prudish age, and where sex was very repressed. There's some evidence, though, that at least underground, or what actually happened in the bedroom but wasn't talked about, was a little kinkier than that. So no longer seen as temptresses, women were believed in the Victorian age to be without sexual desire. Interestingly, there's some more modern writings are suggesting that this is because women started to, the rate that women died in childbirth was extremely high. And there wasn't reliable contraception. So if you're a woman and you didn't want to die, the best thing you could do is keep your husband from pawing you, and you could say, I don't want to have sex. And there's some belief that some of the reason why women seemed more prudish is with their realizing and trying was they were trying to control, they were trying to use it as contraception, saying no sex as contraception so they wouldn't die in childbirth. That's been written about. Um, but during this time, you saw some really interesting things happen is that people started, physicians believed that masturbation was extremely bad for you. And these devices were made, and you can see some pictures of them, I believe, in the videos, or you can look them up. But anti-masturbation devices. So you saw people creating um, like these devices that held the penis in or put these spikes around it, or you also had devices that locked a woman's um, lower regions off so that a man couldn't get into them. So you started to see these devices like this. Um, and also, interestingly, um, if you think about Kellogg cereal, Kellogg was one of the first nutritionists and also the person who invented graham crackers. And what they believed is that sexual lust was caused by spicy food. So they actually invented cornflakes and the graham cracker as an antidote to wanting to masturbate. So there was a lot of focus on making people not masturbate. They believed that, yeah, that it would make you sick, and that there was only so much semen in a man's body, and if you masturbated, you used it all up. Um, there was a huge emphasis on seeming proper on the outside anyway, which is, I think, where we get these ideas that they're very prudish. But again, there's more evidence today that beneath the sheets in the privacy of their bedrooms, a lot more kinky stuff went on. Um, one really important thing that happened in the Victorian era is you start to see the medicalization of sex. Prior to the Victorian era, if you had an unusual sexual interest, if you were a man who liked to have sex with men, woman who liked to have sex with women, or you liked oral sex, we saw this as a sin. Sometimes we'd even see it as being as 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 needing an exorcism, as being inhabited by the devil or by demons. But the Victorian era really saw the rise of medical science, and people, psychiatrists and doctors started writing about unusual sexuality as being, instead of a sin, being a disease. Some very important, famous early people who wrote about this were Richard von Krafft Ebing. He coined the word homosexuality and also sexual sadism. Um, Again, now we don't think of these things as diseases today for the most part, but this probably was an advance in terms of destigmatizing unusual sexuality. Freud came at the end of the Victorian era. He came at about 1880 and wrote a lot during 1900 and the early 1900s, and he started to really normalize sex. He saw a lot of educated women in his private practice, and they told him their deepest, darkest sexual secrets. So he started to write about women and kids as also being sexual beings, not just men. We only thought that adult men were sexual beings, but he wrote about men, about women and children as well. Okay, so the early 1900s, few things happened. You had the First World War. I'm going to play you a song here, and this is by Bessie Smith. She is the lady here on the right. You see the beginnings of rock music, right? With the jazz. This song is called Empty Bed Blues. It's blatant sexuality, is written in 1928. Um, One thing about Bessie Smith is I think of her as kind of an early diva. Um, she and I don't know if any of you know who she is, but if you think along the lines of Madonna, who are some of our divas now? Miley Cyrus, Lady Gaga, Bessie Smith. She was openly bisexual. She was a drug addict. She was in trouble with the law. She shot her husband with a shotgun. She had a crazy life. But I mean, I'm not trying to romanticize those things, but if you look at our modern day divas, the troubled divas who were sort of sexually, like Miley Cyrus, sexually fluid, she was sort of the beginnings of this. But she wrote very openly about sexuality. Um, this Rosie the Riveter, one important thing that happened in these times, and remember what I said, a common theme is that when men went off to war, women got more rights and they usually more sexual freedoms. Um, let's see, this picture of Rosie the Riveter, this comes from World War II. But during World War I and particularly World War II, when the men went off to fight, the women started doing more. They started in World War II. They went to work. They went to work in the factories, and whereas they used to stay home, and that's where you get this poster from. There's an old movie with Madonna in it called A League of Their Own, where the National Baseball Association or whatever it was called closed down, and the women went to play baseball to give people entertainment. So, but with these new roles, women also got more rights. You also started to see the way women dressed changed. Women started wearing short hair. You had the flappers. Women started wearing pants, and you had the first sexual revolution where we started talking more and more about women enjoying sex too. You see the development of a counterculture, much like there's always been a counterculture, right? You know, whether it was hippie culture or beatniks, there's always been some sort of counterculture where you had music and art coming out of it, but also a way of dressing and a way of thinking. Um, Also, some things you saw here in terms of technology, you saw the first movies. Um, and again, I said that pornography came out like a year later. Um, so you started to see erotic images promulgating visual arts. Um, Something also important that happened medically was in 1928. You got the discovery of penicillin, the very first antibiotic. Up until this time, you could treat syphilis or gonorrhea, but you couldn't cure them. And the discovery of penicillin meant that you could completely cure them. Now, up until the 1900s, sex could have serious consequences. Either it would result in a baby, which is a serious consequence, or it could result in a disease that could be life-threatening. But suddenly you get more reliable and more birth control, that people have greater access to, like condoms. But you also get these medications that make these diseases not only treatable but curable. And then, of course, in the 1960s, we get really effective birth control, which meant that you could have sex and not have any negative consequences. That's a really big deal. In the 1960s and 70s, you saw the second sexual revolution. Again, more freedom for women. The birth control pill came out in the 1960s. Women could control their own reproduction, and shortly around that time, also the IUD, which probably doesn't get enough attention. Um, the IUD, by the way, when it first came out, there was a particular kind of IUD that resulted in some deaths. So people stopped using the IUD, but today it's getting a resurgence because it still is very, very effective, and you don't have to remember it to take it daily like you do the birth control pill. Again, another war in the late 60s. You saw the Vietnam War, men go off, more sexual freedoms, a lot of political unrest. Okay, then I'm going to move ahead to the 80s. A couple important things happened in the 80s. You saw the development of the religious right, and prior to this time, religion was more associated with the American Democratic Party, by the way. But in this time, and something very important happened here, and that's that you had the first cases of AIDS or HIV, and you saw a swing back to more conservative ideas about sexuality. There's a huge Ronald Reagan had a huge commission established to look at the effects of pornography. They actually did some research in Denmark, because Denmark had pornography was legal since 1969. You saw the AIDS epidemic, and you saw a swing back to more conservative ideals. And then roughly, I'm going to say we're at the current time period, and I'm going to end this lecture. And if you have questions, please post them beneath the lecture, and I'll answer them in our next lecture.